This is the video for 9.4 and we are talking about solving quadratic equations. And remember what we mean by solving quadratic equations. When we ask you to solve a quadratic equation, what we are asking you is, what is the value of x when y equals 0? In other words, where does this parabola cross over or touch the x-axis, if at all? So in the last lesson, we talked about how to solve quadratic equations by finding the square roots. And that technique is used when b equals 0. When b equals 0, you don't have this middle term, so your quadratic equation will look like this. And when you have an equation that looks like this, the best way to solve is by finding the square roots. So that's what we learned about in the last lesson, how to solve quadratic equations when b is 0. But now we're going to talk about how do you solve when b is not 0. What do you do when you do have that middle term? So before we talk about that, we have to review the zero product property. Remember what the zero product property says. Whenever you multiply anything by 0, your answer is going to be 0. So in other words, if a times b equals 0, then you know a must have been 0 or b must have been 0. So remember that, and now go to example number 1. Example number 1 says 4t plus 1 times t minus 2 equals 0. So let's think about this. If this factor times this factor equals 0, then either this factor or this factor must have been equal to 0. So that's what we're doing. This is how to solve. This is how you solve this. Since this factor times this factor equals 0, either this factor must equal 0 or this factor must equal 0. One of them must equal 0, since when you multiply them together, you get 0. So what you need to do is set each factor equal to 0 and then solve. So the possible values for my variable that will make this equation true, the values of the variable that will make this equation equal to 0 are negative 1 over 4 and 2. When t is negative 1 over 4, this equation is equal to 0. And when t is 2, this equation is also equal to 0. So those are your two solutions. And then what does that mean on a graph? This parabola is going to cross over the x-axis at negative 1/4 and at 2. So now let's look at the next example. X plus 1 times x minus 5 equals 0. Again, this factor times this factor equals 0. So then, because of the zero product property, that means either this factor or this factor must equal 0. Because when I multiply them together, I get 0. So one of them must equal 0. So what do? I set both factors equal to 0, and then I solve both. So what are my possible values for x that will make this equation true? X is going to equal negative 1, or x is going to equal 5. When x is negative 1, this equation is equal to 0. And when x is 5, this equation is also equal to 0. So the possible values for x that will make this equation true is negative 1 and 5. And again, what does this mean on a graph? This means the graph will cross over the x-axis at -1 and at 5. So now go ahead and hit pause and do these two on your own problems and find the values for the variables that will make these equations true. And here are the answers. Pause the video and check your work against mine, and if you got it wrong, please redo it. Okay, so now that you know that, the rest of this is review. You have learned already how to factor, and we learned about this in Chapter 8. So if you need to go over any of those Chapter 8 videos that talk about how to factor, please re-watch those videos. Because now here I'm given a quadratic equation and I am asked to solve. In other words, find the values of x that are going to make this equation equal to 0. So what do I need to do? I need to factor it. And let's just review really quickly how we do that. We are finding the factors of 15 that add up to 8. And so the factors of 15 that add up to 8 are 5 and 3. So my factors are x plus 5 and x plus 3. This quadratic equation has factors into x plus 5 times x plus 3. So now what do? I use the zero product property and I set both factors equal to 0 and then I solve. And then here I did the exact same thing. Let me just review how to factor this. Remember to read the signs. You're asking yourself, what are the factors of -14 that add up to -5? And think about what the signs are telling us. The signs of my factors are going to be different, and my larger one must be negative. So the factors are -7 and 2. The factors of -14 that add up to -5 are -7 and 2. So how does this quadratic equation factor? It factors into m minus 7 times m plus 2. And then what do? I use the zero product property. I set both factors equal to 0, and then I solve. Okay, so now go ahead and hit pause and work out these two on your own problems. Now remember, here you have to use the box method. A is not 1, so you have to factor using the box method. And remember, if you need to go back and re-watch that video, which teaches you how to use the box method to factor, please go back and re-watch that. And here are the answers. Let me just review with you very quickly how to factor a quadratic equation when A is not 1. You have to first ask yourself, what are the factors of A times C that add up to B? So I'm asking myself, well, what are the factors of 36 that add up to -15? And the factors are -3 and -12. Think about what the signs are telling us. Both of the signs are going to be the same, and they're both going to be negative. So that's what I put here in these two boxes. Remember? Here I put the first term, here I put the last term, and then I just take out the greatest common factor from each row, and I take out the greatest common factor from each column. And then remember, I keep the sign of the term that's closest to the exit. So since this is negative, this will be negative. Since this is positive, this is going to be positive, and this is going to be positive. And since this is negative, this is going to be negative. And so that's how I got my factors. And then I set them both equal to 0, and then I solve. And finally, example number 3. This is not any different than what we were just doing. The only thing that's different here is you have to set the equation equal to 0. You cannot begin to factor this until you set the equation equal to 0. Then, once you set the equation equal to 0, here I have to use the box method to factor. I get my factors, I set them both equal to 0, and then I solve for the possible values for the variable. So you can pause the video and you can actually work this problem out on your own. Check your work against mine, and if you have any questions, let me know. But we have learned all of this before. Nothing's new. The only thing that's new here is you're solving for x. You're saying, okay, well, I factored it. Now, what are my possible values for x given the fact that this equation is equal to 0? That's the only thing new we're doing in this lesson. And then go ahead and hit pause and work out this on your own problem. And here's the answer. Now notice, once I set this equation equal to 0, what do I have? I have a perfect square. It's going to be very important for you in Algebra 2 and in college algebra. Remember that you be able to identify a perfect square. So I have a perfect square, and so what does that mean? It means there is only one possible value for x that will make this equation equal to 0, and that is x equals -7. There's only one solution, and that is at x equals -7. So what does this mean on a graph? It means this parabola is actually only going to touch the x-axis in one place, and that is going to be at -7.